The cruelest betrayals rarely come from strangers. They come from the people who convince everyone else that you never mattered. Before we continue, where are you watching from today? Share your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe kindness deserves respect, remember to like this video and subscribe because every story here reminds us that dignity always finds its way back home. Now, back to Emily Carter. On a bright Saturday afternoon in late September, the Carter family gathered at the century-old farmhouse where birthdays, holidays, graduations, and countless family traditions had unfolded for generations. Golden sunlight spilled across the wide front porch, children chased each other across the freshly cut lawn, and the smell of homemade apple pie drifted through the crisp autumn air. To anyone passing by, it looked like the perfect family reunion. But hidden beneath the laughter was a quiet injustice that had been growing for years, one polite smile at a time. Emily Carter stepped out of her aging blue sedan wearing the same simple light blue dress she always wore to family gatherings. She carried a small homemade peach cobbler wrapped carefully in a white kitchen towel, just as her grandmother had taught her years before. Her smile was warm, her movements calm, and her eyes reflected the quiet hope that perhaps today would feel different. She paused for a moment before walking toward the house, noticing several luxury vehicles parked along the circular driveway. She recognized one immediately. It belonged to her wealthy cousin, Victoria Hayes. Inside the farmhouse, Victoria had already become the center of attention. Wearing an elegant cream designer dress and sparkling jewelry, she greeted relatives with expensive gifts, confident laughter, and carefully chosen compliments. Every conversation seemed to revolve around her latest vacation, her successful investments, or the exclusive charity events she attended. Family members admired her success without realizing how easily admiration had slowly become dependence. They laughed when she laughed. They agreed when she spoke. And over time, they had begun forgetting someone else. Entirely. Emily quietly entered through the front door, offering soft greetings to relatives she had not seen in months. A few smiled politely before returning their attention to Victoria. Others barely noticed she had arrived. She did not complain. She simply walked toward the dining room to place her dessert beside the long table covered with homemade dishes. That was when she stopped. At the head of the table stood an elegant wooden chair decorated with fresh flowers and a handwritten card that read, "Reserved for Victoria, the heart of our family." Emily stared silently at the card. For more than 10 years, that chair had belonged to the family member who organized birthdays, cared for elderly relatives, remembered every anniversary, and quietly kept everyone connected. It had never been an official tradition, yet every year the family had naturally placed Emily there because everyone knew she was the one who held them together. Until now. Victoria noticed Emily standing motionless across the room and smiled with practiced sweetness. "Oh, Emily," she said loudly enough for nearby relatives to hear, "I hope you do not mind." Everyone agreed it was time for a little change. Families move forward, you know. Several relatives nodded awkwardly. Others avoided looking at Emily altogether. No one questioned how that decision had been made. No one asked who had actually carried the family's traditions through all those years. Emily looked at the chair one last time before setting her homemade dessert quietly beside dozens of expensive catered dishes. She forced a gentle smile and simply replied, "I came to spend time with my family. That is enough for me." Victoria's confident smile grew even wider, believing the moment belonged entirely to her. But neither she nor anyone else in that farmhouse realized they had just replaced the wrong person, and, before the weekend was over, a forgotten piece of their family's history would quietly begin revealing a truth no amount of wealth could ever erase. Emily quietly stepped away from the dining room before anyone noticed the disappointment hidden behind her gentle smile. She carried herself with the same quiet grace she had shown for years, refusing to let a painful moment become a public argument. Outside, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves across the wide backyard where generations of Carter family memories had been created. Children laughed beneath the old maple tree while relatives gathered in small circles, sharing stories that somehow no longer included the person who had helped preserve so many of them. Emily found herself standing near the flower garden her grandmother had planted decades earlier. She gently brushed her fingers across a blooming white rose and allowed herself a single deep breath. This garden had once been their favorite place together. Every spring they worked side by side, trimming branches, planting flowers, and talking about the importance of keeping a family together through kindness instead of pride. Her grandmother often smiled and said that flowers never competed with one another because each one simply bloomed in its own season. Emily had carried those words through every difficult year of her life. While many relatives remembered birthdays only after receiving reminders, Emily quietly organized every family gathering, mailed handwritten holiday cards, visited elderly relatives at hospitals and nursing homes, and spent countless weekends helping her grandmother maintain the farmhouse after storms damaged the old roof or heavy snow covered the long driveway. She never kept track of how many hours she gave because she believed love was measured through actions rather than recognition. Even after beginning her full-time job at the local elementary school library, she still drove nearly 40 miles every Saturday to help with groceries, cleaning, and repairs whenever her grandmother needed assistance. Most of those visits happened when no one else was available. Her grandmother always noticed, even if the rest of the family rarely did. Everything slowly changed after Victoria Hayes became financially successful. Expensive holiday gifts replaced handmade traditions. Professional caterers replaced family recipes. Luxury decorations replaced old keepsakes collected through generations. None of those changes seemed harmful at first. In fact, everyone admired Victoria's generosity. She offered to pay for larger celebrations, remodeled several rooms inside the farmhouse, and surprised relatives with vacations and thoughtful presents. Gratitude gradually became admiration, and admiration quietly became influence. Without realizing it, the family began listening to Victoria more often than they listened to one another. She never openly criticized Emily. Instead, she used softer words that slowly reshaped everyone's opinions. Emily is so busy these days. She probably does not enjoy organizing gatherings anymore. Let me handle everything this year. One sentence led to another until relatives stopped asking Emily for help altogether. The transition happened so gradually that almost no one recognized it. Victoria never needed to force Emily aside. She simply stepped into every empty space before anyone noticed it had once belonged to someone else. Back inside the farmhouse, laughter filled the dining room as Victoria raised a glass to welcome everyone. Emily quietly carried extra serving dishes from the kitchen without being asked, smiling politely whenever someone thanked her as though she were simply another helpful guest. No one remembered that she had once planned every seating arrangement, prepared every family slideshow, baked every birthday cake, and spent weeks making certain every reunion felt special. Those memories had become invisible beneath years of polished appearances. As Emily returned to the kitchen, she noticed her elderly Aunt Margaret slowly climbing the narrow staircase toward the dusty attic. Before disappearing around the corner, the older woman paused, looked thoughtfully toward Emily, and softly said, "I think your grandmother left something up there that everyone forgot about." Emily watched her disappear into the shadows above, never imagining that a forgotten wooden keepsake box hidden beneath decades of family memories was quietly waiting to tell a story that no amount of money had ever been able to rewrite. Emily stood quietly in the kitchen doorway as the sounds of cheerful conversation drifted through the old farmhouse. Plates clinked together. Children laughed somewhere outside, and relatives complimented the elegant decorations Victoria had arranged for the reunion. Every smile seemed to confirm that the family believed everything had become better than ever before. Emily picked up a stack of clean serving plates and carried them toward the dining room without drawing attention to herself. She moved naturally through the gathering, refilling pitchers of iced tea, helping an elderly uncle find a comfortable chair, and making certain every guest had enough food before taking a seat herself. It was exactly what she had always done. The only difference was that no one seemed to remember she had been the one doing it for years. Victoria stood at the center of the room, effortlessly directing conversations with polished confidence. She introduced the gourmet catering company she had hired, explained the expensive floral arrangements, and accepted compliments with graceful smiles. Every few minutes, another relative thanked her for bringing new life into the family's traditions. "Everything feels so much more organized now," one cousin remarked. "Grandmother would be proud of what you have done," another added. Victoria accepted every compliment with practiced humility. "I simply wanted everyone to feel special," she replied warmly. Emily quietly lowered her eyes and continued arranging serving dishes. She remembered countless evenings when her grandmother had stayed awake beside her baking pies until midnight before holiday gatherings because they could not afford catering. She remembered repairing worn tablecloths by hand instead of replacing them. She remembered collecting wildflowers from nearby fields because fresh bouquets from a florist were too expensive. None of those memories were ever meant to compete with luxury. They simply reflected love expressed through ordinary effort. As dinner began, Victoria gently tapped her glass to gain everyone's attention. The conversations faded into silence. "Before we eat," she said with a confident smile, "I would like to thank everyone for trusting me to continue our family traditions. Change is never easy, but sometimes families need someone willing to lead them into a new chapter." Several relatives applauded politely. Victoria then looked toward Emily with a sympathetic expression that felt carefully rehearsed. "And of course, we appreciate everything Emily did in the past. Life changes, people move on, and we all have different priorities now." The room remained quiet. No one questioned whether Emily had ever chosen to step away. No one asked whether anyone had actually invited her to continue serving in the role she had quietly filled for so many years. Emily simply smiled with gentle sincerity and nodded once. "I hope everyone enjoys the afternoon," she said softly before returning to the kitchen to bring out another tray of food. Her calm response only strengthened Victoria's confidence. She believed silence meant acceptance. She believed the story she had carefully shaped over the years had finally become permanent truth. Upstairs, however, Aunt Margaret slowly brushed away decades of dust inside the old attic. Sunlight filtered through a small circular window as she opened weathered trunks filled with forgotten quilts, family photographs, handwritten recipes, and faded Christmas ornaments. Then, beneath an old wool blanket embroidered by Grandmother Carter herself, she noticed a small cedar keepsake box secured with a brass latch. A handwritten label rested on top in unmistakable familiar handwriting. It read simply, "For the family, when memories begin to fade." Aunt Margaret gently lifted the box into her hands, unaware that inside rested the quiet truth capable of restoring everything that appearances and time had slowly taken away. The afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the farmhouse windows as dinner came to an end. Conversations drifted from the dining room onto the wide front porch while children continued playing beneath the old maple tree. Victoria accepted another round of compliments with effortless confidence, thanking relatives for embracing what she proudly called a new chapter for the Carter family. She believed the day had unfolded exactly as she had planned. Emily quietly gathered empty serving dishes from the long dining table and carried them into the kitchen without asking anyone for help. She smiled whenever a relative thanked her for clearing the table, never reminding anyone that she had once planned every reunion from beginning to end. Kindness had become such a natural part of her character that she no longer expected recognition for it. Upstairs, Aunt Margaret carefully carried the cedar keepsake box down the narrow staircase with both hands. Years of dust still rested across its carved lid, but the handwritten label remained perfectly readable. Several relatives noticed the box immediately and gathered around with quiet curiosity. Victoria turned toward her aunt with a pleasant smile. "What did you find?" she asked. Aunt Margaret gently placed the box in the center of the living room coffee table. "Your grandmother wanted this opened only if our family ever forgot what truly mattered," she answered softly. The room gradually fell silent. Even the children wandered inside, sensing that something important was about to happen. Emily stood quietly near the kitchen doorway, uncertain why her grandmother would have left such a message. Victoria remained composed, assuming the box simply contained old photographs or sentimental keepsakes. Aunt Margaret slowly lifted the brass latch. Inside rested neatly bundled letters tied with faded blue ribbon, carefully labeled envelopes, family journals, handwritten recipes, dozens of photographs, small repair receipts, grocery lists, birthday cards, and a leather notebook filled with Grandmother Carter's familiar handwriting. Everything had been preserved with extraordinary care. Resting on top was a sealed envelope addressed simply to my family. Aunt Margaret looked around the room before opening it. "I think everyone should hear this together," she said. No one objected. She unfolded the letter carefully and began reading aloud. If you are listening to these words, then time has probably done what it always does. Memories fade more quickly than love, and appearances often become louder than quiet acts of kindness. Every conversation disappeared. Aunt Margaret continued reading in her calm voice. "One day you may wonder who truly carried this family through difficult seasons. Do not look first at success or wealth. Look instead at the person who arrived first when someone was sick, stayed last after every gathering, remembered birthdays without reminders, and loved this family even when no one was watching." Emily lowered her eyes. Victoria remained motionless. Aunt Margaret reached the next paragraph. "I kept records because gratitude deserves a memory. Inside this box you will find notes, photographs, and journals showing who faithfully cared for this home after every storm, who repaired broken fences beside me, who drove miles every weekend simply to make sure I was never alone, and who protected our family traditions without asking for praise." Several relatives slowly looked toward Emily as quiet recognition began replacing comfortable assumptions. Aunt Margaret carefully lifted the first bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Every envelope carried the same handwritten notation beneath the date. "Visits from Emily." Victoria's confident smile slowly disappeared as Aunt Margaret reached for the first letter, unaware that every page inside the cedar box had been patiently waiting for years to restore a truth the family had almost allowed themselves to forget. The living room remained completely silent as Aunt Margaret untied the faded blue ribbon surrounding the first bundle of letters. No one reached for a drink. No one whispered another word. Even the children seemed to understand that something precious had been waiting for this moment. Emily stood quietly near the kitchen doorway with her hands folded together, uncertain what her grandmother had chosen to preserve all those years ago. Victoria remained beside the fireplace, maintaining her composed posture, although the confidence that had carried her throughout the afternoon had begun to fade. Aunt Margaret carefully unfolded the first handwritten letter and smiled softly as she recognized the familiar handwriting. "March 15th, she read aloud. "Emily drove 42 miles through heavy rain today because my arthritis made it difficult to leave the house. She repaired the leaking kitchen faucet, brought groceries, cleaned the pantry, and never allowed me to pay for the gasoline. She said family is not measured by convenience." The room became even quieter. Aunt Margaret reached for another letter. July 23rd. "Emily spent the entire weekend repairing the porch railing after the summer storm. She refused to hire contractors because she wanted to preserve your grandfather's original woodwork exactly as he built it." She continued reading. Every page described another ordinary act of kindness that no one else had witnessed. There were grocery receipts carefully stapled beside handwritten notes explaining that Emily had quietly purchased medications whenever her grandmother's monthly budget became difficult. There were photographs showing Emily repainting old fences, planting flowers beneath the front porch, organizing holiday decorations, baking birthday cakes, and sitting beside her grandmother during long evenings while reading favorite books aloud. Nothing inside the cedar box celebrated wealth or recognition. Everything celebrated quiet devotion. Victoria slowly looked around the room, noticing expressions changing one by one. Cousins who had applauded her only an hour earlier now studied the photographs with growing disbelief. Emily's uncle carefully lifted one faded picture showing Emily and her grandmother rebuilding the flower garden together after an unusually harsh winter. "I thought professionals did this," he whispered. Aunt Margaret gently shook her head. "Emily came every Saturday for nearly 5 years." Another envelope contained neatly organized calendars with handwritten entries marking every visit Emily had made. Beside many of the dates, Grandmother Carter had written short reflections. Emily never forgets. She always arrives before I ask. She says keeping traditions alive is worth every mile. Victoria quietly lowered her eyes. She remembered telling relatives that Emily had become too busy to participate in family life. Until this moment, she had believed those words herself because Emily had never defended her own sacrifices. Aunt Margaret then opened the leather notebook resting beneath the letters. It contained page after page of family memories recorded by Grandmother Carter. Near the middle, she found a passage carefully underlined in blue ink. She read it slowly. If one day someone receives more praise than Emily, do not blame success. Blame forgetfulness. She will probably remain silent because she has always believed love speaks through service instead of applause. But silence must never become permission to erase the truth. Several relatives quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Emily remained exactly where she had been standing since the reading began, showing neither pride nor resentment. She simply listened with humble gratitude, hearing her grandmother's voice once again through words written long before anyone realized they would become the family's greatest lesson. Aunt Margaret gently closed the notebook before reaching toward one final sealed envelope resting alone at the bottom of the cedar box. Written across the front in careful handwriting were 7 simple words that immediately captured everyone's attention. Please read this only after everyone remembers Emily. The sealed envelope rested quietly in Aunt Margaret's hands as every member of the Carter family watched in complete silence. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the farmhouse floor, illuminating the cedar keepsake box that had patiently guarded decades of forgotten memories. No one reached for another photograph. No one interrupted. The weight of everything they had already heard had changed the atmosphere inside the room. Emily remained near the kitchen doorway with her familiar calm expression, never asking anyone to defend her because she never believed genuine truth required a louder voice. Victoria stood only a few feet away, her confident posture slowly giving way to quiet uncertainty. Aunt Margaret carefully opened the final envelope and unfolded several neatly written pages. She recognized Grandmother Carter's graceful handwriting immediately. Taking a slow breath, she began reading aloud. If this letter is ever opened, then I imagine my family has reached a moment when appearances have become more persuasive than memories. Before you continue judging one another, I ask only one thing. Remember who remained beside me when there was nothing to gain. Accept the joy of helping someone you love. Aunt Margaret paused briefly before continuing. Emily never served this family because she expected recognition. She served because she understood that love grows strongest through ordinary acts repeated faithfully over many years. She has never asked for the best seat at the table because she believed her place was already secure inside our hearts. If one day another person seems brighter, wealthier, or more impressive, do not mistake admiration for gratitude. Admire success if you wish, but never forget the quiet soul who carried this family through seasons no one else remembers. Several relatives slowly lowered their eyes. Emily's uncle carefully folded his hands together while her cousins exchanged uncomfortable glances. Each page they had heard revealed another piece of a history they had unknowingly allowed themselves to forget. Aunt Margaret continued reading. Victoria has many gifts, and I hope she uses them wisely. But no amount of success should ever replace the person who faithfully protected our traditions when no one was watching. Families become strongest when every heart is valued, not only the loudest voice or the largest gift. Victoria quietly closed her eyes for a moment. Those words carried no accusation, only gentle wisdom. Somehow that made them even more difficult to hear. She remembered every holiday when Emily had arrived early carrying homemade food while she herself arrived later with expensive presents. She remembered accepting compliments that had once naturally belonged to someone else. She remembered believing that because everyone praised her, she must deserve every bit of it. Emily never corrected anyone. She never reminded relatives about forgotten weekends spent repairing the farmhouse, comforting Grandmother Carter through lonely evenings, or preserving traditions everyone now celebrated. She had simply continued loving the family without keeping score. Aunt Margaret folded the final letter and looked around the room. Your grandmother wanted this read only after everyone remembered Emily because she believed truth should awaken gratitude instead of guilt. Those words settled gently over the family. Emily quietly stepped forward, not to reclaim the honored chair or receive apologies, but simply to help Aunt Margaret place every letter, photograph, and journal carefully back inside the cedar box. She handled each page with the same respect she had always shown her grandmother's memories. Watching her do that, several relatives suddenly understood something no document alone could fully explain. The greatest proof of Emily's character was not hidden inside the keepsake box. It was standing silently before them, still choosing kindness even after years of being quietly replaced. The silence inside the farmhouse lingered long after Aunt Margaret closed the final letter. No one hurried back to casual conversation. The laughter that had filled the house earlier that afternoon had quietly disappeared, replaced by thoughtful faces and lowered eyes. Every family member seemed to be looking at Emily for the first time instead of simply looking past her. She stood beside the cedar keepsake box with her familiar, gentle expression, carefully placing each photograph and handwritten journal back into its proper place. She handled every memory with the same patience she had shown throughout the years, never drawing attention to herself even when the truth finally had. Victoria remained near the fireplace, unable to ignore the growing weight of everything she had heard. The compliments that had surrounded her only an hour before now echoed differently in her mind. She realized they had been built upon assumptions that no one, including herself, had ever bothered to question. Slowly, she walked toward Emily. Every step felt heavier than the last. The family watched in complete silence. Victoria stopped only a few feet away and looked directly into Emily's calm eyes. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. "Not because grandmother wrote those letters, but because I stopped seeing you long before everyone else did." Emily remained quiet, allowing her cousin to continue without interruption. Victoria lowered her head. "I told myself I was helping this family by making everything bigger, more beautiful, and more impressive. Somewhere along the way I convinced myself that replacing traditions was the same as honoring them. I accepted praise that never truly belonged to me, and I never asked who had carried those responsibilities before I arrived." Several relatives quietly nodded, recognizing their own mistakes in her words. Emily's uncle stepped forward next. "We all share responsibility," he admitted. "We enjoyed the comfort of letting someone else lead without remembering who had already been serving this family for years." One by one, cousins, aunts, and uncles offered sincere apologies. None of them spoke dramatically. They simply acknowledged the truth that had been hidden behind convenience and appearances. Emily listened patiently to every word before finally speaking. "I never wanted anyone to feel guilty," she said gently. "Grandmother taught me that families become stronger when they remember together, not when they blame one another. What matters most is what we choose after today." Her answer surprised everyone. There was no bitterness in her voice. No desire to reclaim recognition. Only quiet grace. Aunt Margaret smiled through grateful tears before walking toward the dining room. She gently removed the handwritten card reserved for Victoria from the honored chair at the head of the table. Without saying a word, she placed the card aside. Then she looked toward Emily. "Your grandmother never assigned that chair because of status," she said. "She believed it belonged to the person who quietly held this family together." Emily hesitated. "Please," she answered softly, "let us leave the chair where everyone can share it." The room fell silent once again. Her response carried more wisdom than anyone expected. Rather than accepting a position above everyone else, she chose to protect the unity her grandmother had always treasured. Aunt Margaret smiled warmly and nodded. Together, several relatives gently moved the chair away from the head of the table and placed it among the others, forming a welcoming circle where no single seat stood above the rest. Watching that simple gesture, the family finally understood that Emily had never been fighting to reclaim a place of honor. She had only been protecting the love that made every place around that table feel like home. The evening settled gently over the old Carter farmhouse as the last rays of sunlight painted the porch in warm shades of gold. The family remained gathered together, not because anyone had asked them to stay, but because no one wanted to leave with the story unfinished. Something inside the house had changed forever. The cedar keepsake box rested quietly on the coffee table, its letters carefully returned to their proper place, yet the memories it had uncovered continued echoing through every conversation and every thoughtful glance. Emily walked into the kitchen to prepare fresh coffee and warm slices of homemade peach cobbler for everyone, just as she had done at countless family gatherings before. She never expected someone else to do it for her simply because the truth had finally been revealed. Service had never been a performance. It was simply part of who she was. This time, however, she did not remain alone for long. Victoria quietly entered the kitchen carrying a stack of clean plates. She hesitated for a moment before placing them beside Emily on the counter. "May I help you?" she asked softly. Emily looked up with the same gentle smile she had offered everyone throughout the day. "Of course," she answered. Together they prepared dessert in comfortable silence. There was no awkwardness, only two cousins slowly discovering that healing often begins with ordinary moments rather than dramatic speeches. When they returned to the dining room carrying the trays together, several relatives immediately noticed the quiet change between them. Emily's uncle stood and carefully moved another chair closer so both women could sit beside one another instead of across the room. No one announced the gesture. It simply felt natural. During dessert, family stories gradually returned, but this time they sounded different. Instead of praising expensive vacations or elegant renovations, relatives began sharing forgotten memories about Grandmother Carter. One cousin remembered how Emily had stayed overnight during a severe winter storm to keep the farmhouse warm after the power failed. Another recalled finding Emily repairing loose fence boards before a family picnic without telling anyone she had done the work. Aunt Margaret smiled as each memory encouraged another. It became clear that Emily's kindness had never disappeared. The family had simply stopped noticing it because quiet faithfulness rarely demands attention. Victoria listened carefully to every story. At one point, she reached into her purse and removed the handwritten card that had earlier reserved the honored chair for her. Looking around the table, she slowly folded the card into a small square before placing it inside the cedar keepsake box. "This belongs with the family history," she said gently. "It reminds me of the day I finally learned the difference between being admired and being truly valued." No one argued. Emily simply reached across the table and rested her hand lightly over Victoria's for a brief moment. It was not a reward. It was forgiveness freely offered. Outside, the first evening stars appeared above the old maple tree while soft laughter once again drifted across the yard. Children resumed their games, relatives gathered for family photographs, and the farmhouse felt alive in a way it had not for many years. As Emily looked around the table, she realized nothing had truly been restored because love had never been lost. It had only been hidden beneath assumptions that the family finally possessed the courage to leave behind. The greatest place anyone could hold in that home was never reserved by a handwritten card or earned through wealth. It was quietly built over years of faithful kindness, and now every heart around the table finally understood why Grandmother Carter had trusted time to reveal the truth. Several months passed, and with each changing season the Carter farmhouse seemed to breathe a little easier. Spring flowers returned to the front garden Emily had lovingly cared for since she was a teenager. The old maple tree stretched its branches across the yard once again, and laughter slowly reclaimed every corner of the home where quiet misunderstandings had once taken root. The cedar keepsake box remained in its place on the living room bookshelf, no longer hidden away in the attic, but displayed where every generation could see it. It was never treated as a treasure because of its age. It became precious because it reminded the family that memories deserved to be protected before they were replaced by assumptions. Emily Carter returned to her ordinary life exactly as she always had. Every weekday morning, she unlocked the doors of the local elementary school library, greeted children with the same warm smile, recommended books with endless patience, and quietly volunteered at community reading events after work. She still drove her aging blue sedan, still wore her favorite simple light blue dress to family gatherings, and still believed that the smallest acts of kindness often mattered most. Nothing about her changed after the family finally recognized everything she had done, because she had never measured her worth through recognition. She measured it through faithfulness. Victoria Hayes also changed, although in a different way. She no longer arrived at family gatherings carrying expensive gifts designed to impress everyone. Instead, she arrived early, helped set the table beside Emily, washed dishes after dinner, and listened far more than she spoke. Her success remained part of her life, but it no longer defined the way she saw herself or the people around her. She discovered that genuine respect could never be purchased. It had to be earned through humility, honesty, and consistent kindness. The rest of the Carter family gradually returned to traditions that had quietly united them for generations. Homemade recipes appeared beside catered dishes without comparison. Family photographs celebrated every relative instead of only the most successful. Children learned the stories behind old quilts, handwritten recipes, and weathered journals so they would understand that the strongest families were built by ordinary people who chose one another every single day. On the anniversary of Grandmother Carter's birthday, everyone gathered once again around the long dining table inside the farmhouse. There was no reserved chair waiting at the head of the table. Every seat carried equal importance because everyone now understood that love could never belong to only one place. Before dinner began, Aunt Margaret carefully opened the cedar keepsake box one final time and removed Grandmother Carter's first letter. She did not read it aloud. She simply placed it in the center of the table beside a fresh bouquet of white roses, allowing its quiet presence to remind everyone of the lesson they had nearly forgotten. Emily looked around the room and saw smiling faces, honest conversations, and hands reaching across the table to serve one another before serving themselves. That simple picture meant more to her than any apology ever could. Outside, the evening sun settled behind the old maple tree as golden light filled the farmhouse windows with gentle warmth. The years had not erased every mistake, but they had transformed those mistakes into wisdom that would guide the family for generations to come. Some people believe the strongest voice always leads a family. Others believe wealth creates importance. But the Carter family learned something far more valuable. The heart of a family is never the person who demands attention. It is the one who quietly keeps loving everyone even when no one is watching, because appearances may change, memories may fade, and success may come and go, but genuine kindness has a way of waiting patiently until the truth finally brings it home.